Hi, class, and welcome to Understanding the Performance Assessment Project. This is your next big assignment in the class after the quiz project. It's worth 15% of your grade. The project is due April 19th, so well after spring break. Instructions and rubric may be found as usual in the assignment folder. If you open the instructions, you'll find the template that I'd like you to do your work directly on, please. Don't do your work separately from the template. The first thing you have to do is to locate or use a standard and to write it out in its entirety. Don't forget to provide the source for the standard, whether it's Common Core, Next Generation Science, etc. You may or may not use the same standard that you used for the quiz project. The next thing you need to do is to think of a learning target that aligns with the standard. Be a little careful about using previous learning targets because a performance task is different than a knowledge task. You will learn or are learning that a performance task is about students doing something, such as writing an essay, solving a complicated math problem, writing a poem, performing a piece of music, doing a poster, and more. As usual, make sure your learning target has a target for success. Write about the context, where the lesson will be taught. You could give the school, you could say what grade level it is, how many students are in the class, are there any gifted students or students with IEPs or 504 plans, what subject will the lesson cover, and what have students been taught so far and what might come next. I encourage you when you're doing this type of project to answer all the questions that are provided. Number 4 is briefly in a lesson, describe the lesson in a paragraph or two that you might use to teach the learning target. It doesn't have to be detailed, but it should convey a clear description of how you will teach the learning target. Next, you're going to write a few paragraphs to describe the performance task that you will use to the thing that will be assessed in this project. So you've taught them, so you have a learning target, you've taught them something, and now they have to do something. Think of the product, the end product that you want them to do. It could be writing an essay. It could be solving a complicated math problem, writing poetry, doing a PowerPoint, something that they perform and not just like multiple choice responses. So you're going to write a few paragraphs describing the performance task, the product that you want them to produce. Number 6 is the teacher rubric that you will use to assess the performance task. So for example, if you're having them write an essay, the teacher rubric would be the rubric you would use to grade the essay. Be sure that your rubric is well suited to the task and grade level, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that the criteria and levels of performance are appropriate and clear, they're well aligned with your, let's just say, learning targets and standards. The descriptions of the teacher rubric should be clear, teachable, identifiable, and measurable. There should be a continuum between levels of performance that are clear and appropriate, and the rubric should be well aligned with the task. As we're learning about rubrics, one of the things that I will be calling your attention to is that you need to start with a set of criteria. So let's say you're doing an essay and you want the criteria to be organization, focus on content, mastery of content rather, um, writing mechanics, and something else. And you have 4 criteria. Couple of things. Make sure the content is the largest uh, weighted among those criteria, because what can happen, especially with writing, is if you have 4 criteria and only one of them is about content, A student could know very little about the content and get a good score on your rubric simply because they're good writers. So it's important to identify the important criteria. It's also important to weight the content properly. And there'll be more about that in the lessons. The other thing I'd like you to remember is once you have your criteria and you begin to write the levels, so what would be a poor um, uh, uh, example of that particular criterion, or a good example or an excellent example, and you write those cell descriptions, make sure that when you go up the levels, that the criteria doesn't change. And there'll be more about that in the lessons as well. So that's your teacher rubric. You're going to develop a second kind of rubric called a student rubric. And this is written in kid-friendly language, and it should be begin with I can statements. So, for example, if you're doing a kid-friendly student rubric for writing, you might say, um, I can um, I can organize my essay so that it's clear, or something like that. Uh, I can write thesis statements. So you take your teacher rubric and you turn it into kid-friendly I can statements. You're going to run a Flesch-Kincaid reading level on your student rubric only, and you're going to give me the grade level. Because just like with your quiz project, students need to be able to read the rubrics in order to understand them. Just like with your quiz project, it should be plus or minus 1 grade level from your standard. You need to write a justification in which you support your choices for the rubric. So you can either use a holistic or an analytic rubric, but I want a justification from the textbook about why you chose the particular type of rubric. You need to cite the textbook. So we've had multiple examples in our discussion posts how to do that. And once again, the reference for how to format the textbook is in your syllabus. A reflection, and like other reflections you've written throughout the course, this is about what went well, what did you learn, what did not go well, what surprised you, what did you learn that you could take forward into your own classroom. I encourage you to read these questions and respond to them. Many of you write reflections as if they're conclusions. You might say, in summary, um, I have written a rubric and it is about this, the end. And that's more like a conclusion. Instead, what I'm looking for is for you to reflect and cognate on the whole experience. What are you going to take forward into your own classroom from this? Rubric writing is hard, or I found it easier than I thought, and here's why. I've learned that when you develop a rubric, you have to do this. These are things to consider as I go forward. That kind of thing goes into reflection. If there are any questions, please feel free to email me about all of this, by the way. We have a grading rubric in the assignments folder, and so I always encourage students print out the grading rubric and keep it near you as you're doing the assignment. You can see the point values I assign for everything we just talked about. Do you have your standard? Does it include the source? Is your learning target written clear? And does it have a target? Context, is that clearly described? Is your lesson clearly described, and is it seamlessly aligned with your learning target? Is your performance task described, and is it aligned with the lesson? Continuing with the rubric, so are your criteria and levels of performance appropriate on the teacher rubric? Is it aligned to the task? Is your student rubric aligned with your teacher rubric, and is it clear? Does it have the right reading level, for example? Justification for the type of teacher rubric, is that there, and do you use a citation? Is a reflection present, and is it not a conclusion? Is it appropriate? Spelling, grammar, professionalism, And finally, rubric presentation. I want to talk about this for a minute. Your rubric must be presented in a table, in a Word table. The reason for this is I don't get them in a Word table. The formatting is all over the place. It makes it difficult to read. It makes it difficult to edit or change. So just use that insert table function from the menu, insert as many columns and rows as you need, and put your rubric in a table. So again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me.